It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
We just signed a document. This is sorry about that. This is it.
A very important document.
President Trump and Keir Starmer sign off their trade agreement. Is it a good deal for the UK? Also,
3 times, Mr. Speaker, these Labour MPs voted against the National Inquiry.
I didn't hear her raise any of these issues until January of this year.
a damning report on grooming gangs sparks a political row, which the report's author says should stop.
That I felt the opposition could have just been a bit, yes, we will all come together behind you. Maybe there's still time to do that.
Ministers want public services like the NHS to reduce social and economic inequalities. The Conservatives say it's a class war. And
every piece of evidence there is suggests that a bit of flexibility agreed between employer and employee is good for productivity, it's good for resilience, it's good for people doing the job.
the Business Secretary thinks working from home can boost the economy. Is he right? Joining me, Labour MP Rachel Maskell, Conservative MP Sir Alex Shelbrooke, Praful Nagand from the economic think tank The Good Growth Foundation, he's also a Labour councillor, and journalist and broadcaster Anaya Falarin Iman. This is Politics Live. So let's start with that G7 summit in Canada, where the President, Donald Trump, has signed an executive order to reduce tariffs on UK cars being shipped to the US. It'll bring into force parts of a tariff deal which was agreed between the two countries last month. So let's have a look at Sir Keir Starmer and the President celebrating this moment.
We all know the great Prime Minister of the UK, and we just signed a document. This is sorry about that. This is it.
A very important document.
A little windy out here. Give me that. We just signed it, and it's done. And so we have our trade agreement with the European Union, and it's a fair deal for both. Going to produce a lot of jobs, a lot of income, and we have many other ones coming. But you see the level of enthusiasm is very good. But the relationship that we have is fantastic. So I just want to congratulate you.
Well, Donald, thank you very much. This now implements on car tariffs and aerospace, our really important agreement. And so this is a very good day for both of our countries, a real sign of strength.
A bit worried about my papers here on the desk now. Just keep them there. Rachel, is this a good deal for the UK?
Well, first of all, this is about jobs, and it's really important to secure jobs, particularly in the automotive industry. We know it's been quite precarious, first of all, with that massive tariff that the President announced. But of course, seeing that drop down and now drop down to 10%, that will be a real boost for particularly the West Midlands, elsewhere, the North East, and of course, Swindon, where we see car manufacturing. And of course, it's not just about the cars, it's about the component industry as well. So that's got to be a positive. Also seeing those zero tariffs coming on the aerospace industry, however, still remains at 25%, saying that we've got to boost our steel production here in the UK. And of course, Labour took that historic move in saving Scunthorpe. So of course, this is really important. It builds that economic security as well, and ensures that we can be that global player when it comes to trade. But I think we've got to look at the fact that this is just the start of a relationship with the United States. The President only came in January, and of course he's dictating from the White House almost the global economy, and of course that's causing real instability here at home. So being able to assure a more stable relationship across the G7 and beyond is absolutely crucial now, so we don't see this volatility in the markets.
So, Alec, do you think the approach taken by Sir Keir Starmer has paid off?
Well, I think when dealing with President Trump, the one thing we know is that going in kicking and screaming and almost insulting will get you absolutely nowhere. So I think you have to show a maturity. And as Rachel says, it is important to try and reduce the tariffs that have been put in place. But let's not fool ourselves. The 25% tariff on steel was what we initially went in to negotiate and say we've got to reduce that. Just because he doubled it to 50% does not mean we've had a deal leaving it at 25%. It's a bit like some of these sales you get on Boxing Day saying half off, but they doubled the prices the week before. And actually, I was listening on Farming Today this morning, and because of the instability that the president has caused, then the pound has strengthened against the dollar, and that's caused a real problem in farming with wheat prices. You know, it is becoming far cheaper to import. So I don't think that we can just say, you know, we're doing really well on this. There are some real consequences that have happened to our economy across several sectors. And, you know, my constituency is a rural economy, and I'm seeing those impacts come through in areas that perhaps people wouldn't think was as relevant.
I mean, it is still a bit worrying, isn't it, Rachel? Lots of tariffs still in place.
Well, that's right, and it's early days of this relationship, and of course we're seeing those discussions happening with other global partners, but our whole dependency on the US has also got to now be differentiated as we look to other countries as well. Of course, strengthening that relationship with the EU, absolutely crucial as we go forward, because they are our nearest trading partners, but also our largest trading partners outside of the US. And it makes sense now that we really concentrate on strengthening those relationships, those trade relationships, to help the economies across our country as well.
Would you agree with that, Alec? Closer to the EU?
Well, I think it's very important that you develop the best trade relationships you can within the circumstances that you have, and that's always going to be an evolving process.
I mean, it's incredibly popular moving more towards the EU rather than pushing towards the US. I mean, Britons don't want to be at the mercy of the erratic behaviour of Donald Trump. We've seen that they see him as unreliable and not a good ally and friend, not a good person to have a reliable relationship with. And actually, trade deals are important because they help to end the crisis of insecurity. They bring stability to this country so we can grow our economy. And so, yes, a trade deal with India, good. A trade deal with the US, defensive, protecting the automotive industry in particular, which is totemic for manufacturing in this country. But that relationship with the European Union, they are our largest trading partner. And what are the things people care about the most? The cost of living crisis, ending that, bringing down the cost of goods. A relationship with Europe will do that. Security, both military and economic, that can be improved through that relationship with Europe in particular.
And do you agree with that?
I don't think it is either or, and I think many of us are perhaps tired of that constant framing of either the US or either the European Union. Ultimately, we need to trade with lots of different countries throughout the world and negotiate as an independent sovereign nation, which is what was very much voted for several years ago in the Brexit referendum. But even going forward to today, I think that Europe is often seen as this kind of panacea. They're struggling just as much, if not more so, when it comes to economic growth. Germany, the economy, has contracted on many occasions, the biggest, economy in Europe. We've seen similar things with France, and so on and so forth. So it's not this kind of golden ticket to save all our economic challenges. But the other thing as well, it does often feel that Keir Starmer is much more comfortable around on the world stage than it is actually grappling with many of these domestic challenges. The truth is that there are questions internally about our economy, whether that is questions around net zero, our ageing population, and I don't really hear
those internal crises if you don't have a stable trading environment.
I think that's fine, but hold on, let me just finish. I think that's fine, but I would like to also have a country that's not so subject to fluctuating international forces, because we have internal resilience, we have industrialisation within our own country.
It's not credible to do that if you don't have stable trading relationships. And
that's why I don't have a problem with the trade deal.
And that's why it's good that he is striking trade deals with the US, with India,
but
and
I don't
with the EU.
see the same kind of economic vision for reform domestically. I hear a lot of talk about trade deals with India and the EU and America, but what's Keir Starmer's actual vision for the United Kingdom?
But we've got to remember the mainstay of our economy, of course, is the service sector and financial services, and the interest there is with the EU, and stabilising those relationships of crucial importance. So whilst these jobs which will be saved and strengthened in manufacturing, that is still a small proportion of our whole economic output. So I think being able to concentrate now on strengthening that relationship with the EU is crucial if we're going to properly stratify our economic base.
Well, I mean, I think that we should have a good relationship with our European neighbours. I don't think they're a panacea. We know with the recent trade deal that was struck that some of our industries, such as fishing, were thrown under the bus. So I think that we should also just be thinking about our national interests and what people voted for democratically, not just what makes us feel good on the world stage.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I mean, we did this big project looking at what voters think about different trading relationships. And actually, these voters that are swapping from Labour to Reform were more likely to want a closer relationship with the European Union than the public overall. Not because they wanted to refight the referendum, absolutely not. I don't think reopening Brexit should be on the table. But in terms of the cost of living, in terms of security, the big issues of the day, if you don't have a stable environment with your partners, with good relationships with good people that you can rely on, you can't make anything happen. And yes, there need to be changes and reforms domestically on the economy. Planning in particular is a big area that needs to change. But you can't have that stable environment if you don't have good trade deals.
Let's turn now to that review into abuse carried out by grooming gangs in England and Wales, which was published yesterday. Baroness Casey, who wrote that report, she spoke to the BBC yesterday, and this is her reflecting on what she found.
I'm blisteringly angry about our failure to protect children and to put them first. I went to Rotherham a decade ago. We knew what was happening in Rotherham. We removed the leadership of the local authority. The cases were prosecuted by the National Crime Agency. That's one of the reasons why I want the National Criminal Investigation to be led by the National Crime Agency. I didn't just do a paper report. I met victims. I went out to different areas of the country. I met the police. I met local authorities. And I've tried to put something together that is balanced, measured, but absolutely clear that we have to have a line in the sand.
Now, Louise Casey's recommendations include the 5 existing local inquiries into grooming gangs will be coordinated by an independent commission with full statutory inquiry powers. That means that they can compel witnesses to give evidence. And the collection of ethnicity and nationality data for all suspects in child sexual abuse and criminal exploitation cases will be made mandatory. Also, every local police force in England and Wales will have to review their records to identify cases of child sexual exploitation that have not been acted upon. Well, this was the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, giving her reaction this morning.
I think it's important to reiterate why we want a national inquiry. It's not just because we believe this is still ongoing. It is because so much activity has taken place. 2014, 2015, 2018, local inquiries and investigations launched by the Home Office, independent reports, independent inquiries, a gangs task force as recently as 2023, finding about 807 perpetrators and 4,000 victims just last year. This is what made me decide that a national inquiry was critical, that no one has joined the dots, that the scale of this is much bigger than any of us envisaged, even as we were looking at this.
Well, there has been quite a political row about all of this. Rachel, do you think it's time for politicians to come together on this issue?
100%. This has got to be about victims and survivors. And of course, yesterday should have been their day when they heard that an inquiry is going to look into these gangs. But what I would say is that because we know that there is a significant amount of abuse happening across all communities, is that we need public authorities to ask themselves questions, difficult questions like, is abuse not happening in my area? And if the answer is no, then to search even deeper, because I know in my constituency and constituencies across the country, I don't believe any authority can have that confidence to say there aren't people, vulnerable children, who are being picked off and groomed, whether that's online, in their own bedrooms, with people stalking them in that way, or indeed in person, and the vile abuse that we've heard. So I do believe Parliament needs to come together over this. It isn't about the politics, it is about the children.
Kemi Badenoch yesterday went on the attack, really, against the Home Secretary, talking about the failures of the past. Do you think it's time politicians stop that?
Well, I certainly think that, we're now at a stage where we have to move this forward. I do think there was an important point that Kemi made yesterday, that when she initially called for it, it was called a far-right bandwagon. And I think that why that's important is because it illustrates how difficult it's been to get to the stage we're now at today, where people are saying, no, it's not a bandwagon, it's not far right, there are real problems that need to be sorted out. I mean, as Rachel says, I cannot imagine that there is a constituency in the country where abuse isn't happening. I mean, my mind just went back to around January when we're talking about the abuse that happened in the Church of England, and I can't remember which bishop was on at the time, and was asked a very direct question by Sarah Montague, can you say that abuse is not happening in the Church of England today? To which the answer is obviously no, I can't say that. And so therefore this isn't just a review of the past, this is saying what can we do right now? And I actually, as I said, I asked the Home Secretary yesterday, I think there are wider issues as well in how it appears to me that some of the instances I've dealt with in the constituency with social services have tended to more towards a box-ticking exercise than actually helping the children. And, you know, I was dealing with a constituent, however they wanted to describe her, she was a child. She was 15, she was a child. And yet, when it came to it, and I was saying, need to do this, it was like, no, we've got to be careful of this, careful of that. Deal with the child. You know, make that your number one priority. So I do believe that, yes, we do need to start moving this forward, but I do think there are important points that need to just look at the very recent past as to why things haven't happened, why there's been that discourse, and now I think we're just in a position where we say we're not going to accuse people of jumping on bandwagons, etc. We're actually going to tackle the issues that have been there in front of us.
Well, the previous Conservative government has been accused of not implementing the recommendations from a very wide-ranging report from Alexis Jay. I mean, why didn't that happen?
Well, I think, you know, it's what Kemi was saying this morning, it had been very disjointed. You know, the dots weren't being connected, and there were things happening. There was one review after another review. I mean, it's not true to say that nothing happened. You know, she pointed out when doing the gangs, there were over 800 people arrested. You know, prosecutions have been coming. But we cannot escape the fact that up until yesterday, when these issues were raised, you would get an attack on from some quarter saying that you were being racist, saying that it was far right, saying you were jumping on a bandwagon. Hopefully yesterday, all of that has a big line drawn under it, and this can now move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree that hopefully we can move forward, but I don't think that we can overlook what has happened over the last 20 years. I thank the courageous victims for relentlessly campaigning, but also there were Labour and left-wing female politicians and journalists such as Sarah Champion, Anne Cryer, Julie Bindel, who were labelled Islamophobic, who were labelled racist.
And this is because many of the grooming gangs were men of Pakistani heritage.
Significantly disproportionately Pakistani and of Muslim heritage.
Well, what Louise Casey actually said is that the figures actually weren't being collected. So it's very difficult to even tell. And she said that is part of the problem here.
Not only that, she actually said that one of the previous Home Office reports that said that the most common perpetrator of group-based child sexual exploitation worldwide was basically based off of no evidence. And we're seeing even more shocking statistics that a significant number of the live cases right now are asylum seekers and also non-UK nationals. So it is a start, but this has essentially been overlooked out of fear of inflaming community tensions, out of fear of being racist. Oftentimes, actually, people within the Muslim community that have been speaking up about this, many people that I've spoken to, have also been silenced because people just do not want to rock the boat. And I think that that is a chilling and disgusting message to say that abuse can be overlooked or turned a blind eye because we're going to prioritise certain things that make us uncomfortable or we don't want to rock the boat. I think that is awful.
Russell, do you think that people did shy away from saying these things?
Look, I think the victims have been let down by all sorts of political shades. I mean, that's very clear. Baroness Casey has said that. And that's precisely why it is really important that there is cross-party consensus on getting change to happen. I'm delighted that we finally got to a national inquiry. I think that's something that's very important. And on data collection, on collecting ethnicity and nationality, it's actually a scandal that this hasn't been collected before. We collect this in so many other areas of life precisely because it gives important information to recognise patterns, to solve problems. And it reinforces how big a scandal this is, that this hasn't been collected in the past and that false recommendations or interpretations have been placed upon flawed data. I'd also just like to mention, it's worth saying as well, you know, the role that misogyny played in this too, how victims were treated like perpetrators. I mean, this is outrageous. This happened in Britain in the 21st century. It has to change.
Rachel?
Yeah, I certainly think data is absolutely key, and that collection of data will really help us look to the future, because this is about protecting children in the future as well.
Do you think that some in Labour did put their head in the sand over ethnicity? They got it wrong?
Well, we have to see the data, but I would say that, you know, that wasn't drilled in hard enough. But we also need to recognise that a scale of child abuse which is familial as well, and we need to collect all of that data and bring it together at source to understand exactly those patterns of abuse. And of course what's happening online, as we heard yesterday in the House, the fact that this scale of abuse would have started online had it started today. So we've got to get a grip of what's happening, not only with the big tech companies, but also with what's happening in people's own homes every single day.
It's important to say that it's not talking about this issue that fuels racism and bigotry and hate. It is the shutting down of discussion, because it's then people feel like they're being gaslit when there's things that they can see in front of their own eyes, and they're seeing disproportionalities and disparities that are not being explained and are being shied away from. And that leaves the ground open for what I think are bad faith actors that want to demonise particular communities and want to make racist claims. It's important for the mainstream to make sure that vacuum isn't being filled by the wrong people. And the only way you do that is to actually speak frankly and openly. It's not just about ethnicity. There's culture, there's social values, there's familial attitudes that we need to look at. And only when we can confront that do we take it away from those that actually do want to divide community.
And better safeguarding as well. And I think that's what came out yesterday. We know particularly children who have got care experience have been targeted by many of these gangs, and we need to ensure better safeguarding in that area. But also I was delighted that the Home Secretary said that she's going to get a grip on the licensing of taxis. It's been a big issue my authority has been trying to come to terms with. It puts an excellent safeguarding training for taxis it licenses, but has no control of people coming into our city.
This is because it was established, wasn't it, a very long time ago, that some of these gangs, that's how they were operating, was through taxi drivers. Yeah. But that's an issue that's been around for a very long time.
Indeed, indeed. There was a Law Commission report on this, and governments, again, have not enacted on that. The last government didn't, and many of us have been struggling with this particular factor, because we know that people are coming into our own locations but have no accountability to the local authorities. So this will help build a bigger picture and more robust systems in order to get on top of this.
Let's have a listen to Sir Keir Starmer back in January, because he's been criticised for what he said back then about grooming gangs.
What I won't tolerate is politicians jumping on the bandwagon simply to get attention, when those politicians sat in government for 14 long years, tweeting, talking, but not doing anything about it. Now so desperate for attention that they're amplifying what the far right is saying.
Rachel, do you think he should apologise for that?
I remember the discussion at the time, and yes, I think part of that focus was the fact that Alexis Jay's findings were not implemented, and it was right to be critical of that. But also, I don't think he could have, as a Prime Minister, say that we shouldn't go further. I think any government in this sphere which says we shouldn't press further, we shouldn't look harder, we shouldn't dig deeper, is denying that there is an issue, and that's where I think the Prime Minister went wrong at that juncture.
And obviously he did order the audit, which has now resulted in the national.
Of course, and it was right to bring in Louise Casey to really drill into this issue.
I mean, if you look at just as recently as a couple of months ago, we had another Labour Minister, Lucy Powell, on BBC Any Questions, when another panellist talked about this issue. She said, well, you're blowing a trumpet and use the same thing about a dog whistle by talking about grooming gangs. So this is clearly a deep cultural challenge within the Labour Party.
Within
there is a squeamishness and a kind of moral and cultural relativism when it comes to talking about issues that might be causing harm that are disproportionately perpetrated by certain ethnic, cultural or religious groups. And we know this because, as I mentioned earlier, Sarah Champion effectively had to resign under Jeremy Corbyn for bringing up the grooming gangs. There is, I think, something within the Labour Party that definitely needs to be looked at, why they feel very uncomfortable when it comes to issues to do with race and ethnicity.
Rachel, can you answer that? Were you unhappy when Lucy Powell said that? I mean, lots of people were pretty offended by her words.
Again, yeah, I'm also offended by that because she wasn't asking the question because she didn't have the data before her. And I think that's what's really important about these recommendations. It's about let's base this on evidence as opposed to subjectivity, which I think is incredibly dangerous when we're looking at something so serious. So I really do welcome this drilling down. Let's have the facts in front of us because we need them to protect children in the future.
Look, the Tories also didn't do a great job on this issue either when they were in government. If you just step back for a second, there does seem to be a problem with British institutions believing victims, right? It's in this case clearly, but step back, think about all the scandals we've had over the last few years, the post office scandal, maternity scandals across the country. There does seem to be a problem. So we're talking about deep-seated cultural issues. I think taking a wider strategic approach on this and asking the question, why do British institutions keep on failing victims is an important question.
I've been asking myself that same question because I think about complaint systems and whether it is with the police, local authority or indeed the NHS. We know that people are just not being heard.
But is an inquiry the way to deal with this? We've had so many of these inquiries and Louise Casey talked about that, saying it's the same pattern. Everyone gets outraged, there's an inquiry and then nothing happens. Are you worried that it's going to take too long?
I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, look how much money we're spending on the COVID inquiry. It seems to spend an inordinate amount of time talking about text messages and relationships in number 10. I don't see how that ever took us towards getting a conclusion, and it's going on and on and on. The inquiry into Iraq went on for such a long time that most of the people involved had left politics. You have to get to answers and get them gone through. But the one thing I wanted to pick up on, I have a concern about easy answers, and I'm by no means suggesting that Rachel said this was an easy answer, but Rachel, you mentioned about social media. I think the report said that this would have happened online, etc. And there are bills coming through to try and limit what children's access to, but I don't think you are ever going to be able to stop that in one way or another. I think there'll be loopholes around it. So actually, and this is difficult, and I don't know how this is done, is that from the classroom, from those interactions with young people, there is going to have to be some sort of way that children who are falling out of the system or there's a suspicion that they're being influenced online can actually have an intervention at that level. Because if we just sit here and say, well, we are doing something to crack down on what's on social media, well, we might be today, but we won't be tomorrow. We're always behind the curve. And so I don't think there's any simple solutions to this. So we have to think far more deeply, and we have to involve all of those people in society who are interacting with children.
But if you want solutions, it will involve politicians working together, won't
Absolutely.
it? But Kemi Bates not yesterday. I mean, she was just very, very angry, wasn't she?
But I think you
was that the right tone?
Well, I think you had to highlight yesterday that when this issue was being raised back, basically forth came insults of accusing you of being on the far right, accusing you of stirring up hatred. And there are still issues here which, we're talking very much about race. We've not talked about people being scared of accusing people and then being said, well, you're homophobic, or being accused of xenophobia, or any of these things. No, there are other phobias, if you will, that are thrown at you to try and silence you.
I do think it is fair to say that the Conservatives did not do anywhere near enough on this issue. But the truth is, Suella Braverman, when she was Home Secretary, she did set up a Grooming Gangs task force, and she did raise the issue of religion and ethnicity, and she had a barrage of abuse. I think there was even one time 50 organisations signed a petition condemning her for making that connection. So the truth is, one of the reasons it's taken so long is because of the amount of silencing that was going on, to such an extent where an extremism report in the Home Office said that mentioning grooming gangs and linking it to certain other cultural factors was an extremist thing to do. We also had an Islamophobia report that said mentioning grooming gangs was an example of Islamophobia. So we've had across institutions a cowardice in confronting this issue, and that's why it's one of the reasons it's taken so long.
Prof, what is cowardice?
Look, there's clearly been a loss of faith in institutions, and what we need to do is to put aside the politics. That's what the public wants. We need people to work together if we're going to get any long-term change in this area.
Now, the Daily Mail has been reporting on a government consultation about implementing what they're calling the socio-economic duty in the Equality Act. Now, this is the take that they have made here, saying that the Tories claim that Keir Starmer is plotting an equality law to penalise middle-class and privately educated people. Now, what they're talking about here is the Labour manifesto, which said that Labour will ensure that no matter whatever your background, you can thrive, and that's why they want to enact this duty from the Equality Act. Now, what do they mean by that, by the socio-economic duty? What they mean is that it's going to require particular public authorities, when making their decisions to decide priorities and set objectives, they must give due regard to how their decisions might help to reduce inequalities associated with this disadvantage. Rachel, how might this work?
Well, first of all, the need is there. Clearly, we're the second most inequitable country on this planet, and we know that that in places like my own constituency, we have a 13-year life expectancy differential, and that's just in one area. So the reason why we see such grotesque inequality is because the institutions of state have turned their back on those that they don't value at the same level. So we've got to be able to hold to account the system, and the best way of holding to account is having a framework and looking at socio-economic impact.
So what
and
might it mean in practice? I've
So,
people watching this,
yeah.
you know, what do we mean? Like the council will have to look at what might they change their mind on?
Well, if you're looking at the distribution of resource, where does that go? What is the consequences of that? And if you draw back into taking a public health approach, as Sir Michael Marmot proposes, then obviously if you invest in ensuring that there is greater equality, that will have better health outcomes, educational outcomes, housing outcomes, and it's better for society as a whole. So really, really important at ensuring that we are addressing the fact that we have got grotesque wealth and also abject poverty sitting side by side, and social policy can make a real difference to shift the dial to ensure that people aren't going hungry, aren't going cold, aren't getting the resources they need to get by in our country.
Alec, your party's calling this class warfare.
Well, I mean, the problem is with policies like this, it's a soundbite. You know, where's actually the practical policies around this? I mean, you know, Rachel said about the grotesquely wealthy. Well, I don't describe them like that. I describe them as high-level taxpayers who are now fleeing the country, where we've seen millions of tax leave the country, messing up the Chancellor's budget from last November. We've seen a number of jobs disappear. And you know, we have to accept that, you know, who generates the wealth. But where I disagree with that, you know, there's an emergency has to be tackled. We in government brought in T-levels. We recognised that academic futures is not for everybody. But how do you level up the perception of the qualification you've got? So we brought in T-levels,
which is completed, and people aren't taking up, and universities don't know what they mean.
But fine, so you would scrap them.
I mean,
and not do
I'm
anything,
really
would you?
interested.
No,
I'm really interested.
really
You said who
important,
generates the wealth in this country. Right? So little faith in British people at large. We have such huge inequality. You don't believe that people, you don't believe that working class people in this country could be contributing to our growth, that we should be enabling their talents and putting them at the heart of policy making in this country.
What a ridiculous thing to say.
It's not ridiculous.
The reality is,
we have
anybody
huge
goes to work
inequality in this country.
Everybody goes to work is a taxpayer. Yes. But if you take away the ability of the big companies to actually operate in this country and employ people, they're sitting on benefits because they're not working.
T-levels,
and they're not paying tax.
When you mentioned T-levels, when we have fewer apprenticeships in this country than we did 10 years ago, is that really enabling people to get on?
But we brought in the apprenticeship scheme, which hadn't existed
which resulted
before.
in a huge reduction in the number of apprenticeships.
And we brought in T-levels, which you're now saying,
did it not
should be scrapped because you said they're not achieving things.
I didn't say that.
This is a soundbite.
I asked you a question.
This is a soundbite.
Did apprenticeships go up or down under the Conservative
government? So talk over each other.
Right, you have got an apprenticeship levy, and there are issues in the system, but at the moment you are just talking about scrapping all of that and hiding behind this soundbite. That's not going to help anybody.
This is a soundbite.
You have
what does does this mean?
Well, I mean, for example, look, you've got a growth in skills levy, which is trying to get that money to people more flexibly. It might mean prioritising those that might actually be able to take advantage of those opportunities. Under the last government, there was a huge increase in the number of people at managerial level that undertook things like apprenticeships. Is that the right way to address inequality, to make the most of our talents in this country? Because I certainly believe, that Britons of all social class can contribute to opportunity and aspiration, and we should enable as well.
Which is why I'm proud of the fact that when we left power, there were a lot more people in work than when we came into power.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree that this is a soundbite. It's completely vague, and we've not really heard anything about what practically this will do. I think it's ridiculous to assume that people, when they're creating policy for whatever party, are not thinking about how to improve society or how to reduce unjust inequalities within society. So adding a kind of bureaucratic layer to public services doesn't really seem to have much benefit to me. I mean, actually, we're seeing challenges with the Equality Act as it already is. For example, bankrupted Birmingham Council over a kind of equal pay claim. There was a recent report by a campaign group called Don't Divide Us, which actually saw that a lot of race equality claims and other claims in relation to the Equality Act were actually undermining a lot of relations in the workplace, where people were viewing slights and misunderstandings in a legal way and taking their employer to the tribunal and actually just not being successful. So I think the Equality Act, as it already stands, needs to be looked at, because I think it's not fit for purpose and just creating loads and loads of identity characteristics and protected characteristics. And adding class to this doesn't really seem to me to get to the structural problems in our economy about how do we create more jobs, how do we have education and apprenticeships and all of these things. Just adding another tick box exercise to the Equality Act.
Is that the problem, Rachel? It's just going to be more impact assessments where people have to try and work out whether they're meeting this or not.
Well, we've got to understand the impact of policy, but it should be the driver of change, and that's really why we need to see the socio-economic markers being put in place, because it says to policymakers that they have got to be aware of the way that it's impacting on those people, particularly those people of lower socio-economic disadvantage, to ensure that they can be levied within a policy suggestion, and to ensure that we are addressing those issues of disadvantage which we know are widespread. Well, this calls it to account, which is really important.
So there you go, now there's it's a check on this.
Well, to me, it sounds like just another tick box exercise. As you mentioned, impact assessments, a more bureaucratic layer, a more expanded HR, which actually does nothing to address the deep-seated issues as why we have growing inequality in our society.
There's a gap in the Equality Act right now. This isn't part of the areas that need to be considered by public authorities, even though we know it is probably the biggest determinant of access to opportunity.
And you don't think they're doing it anyway?
Well, of course, people will be considering this to some extent, but this will put formality, it will put it at the heart of public decision-making, and that's important if we actually want to make change.
That sounds right.
I just don't think there's any evidence that has worked or that it's doing that. And we've actually not even seen this in any kind of concrete, meaningful sense, just trying to speak and find out what this will mean practically. We're not really getting much from that.
Well, it doesn't work because we don't have it in place. But let me give you an example. We're about to see significant change in the support that disabled people get from the DWP. If the socio-economic impact assessment was in place, it would demonstrate that disabled people losing vital social security will be pushed into greater deprivation and therefore greater socio-economic disadvantage. Therefore, laws like that will not be able to proceed as a result. So I would say it's a positive thing to protect people at the greatest area of disadvantage, and therefore to be able to challenge government back around its own decision-making to ensure there is greater access to opportunity.
I think that even when we look at something like socio-economic, no doubt that there are challenges there, but I think it's much more complicated than a duty. There might be somebody that might be from an ostensibly wealthy background, but come from a difficult, broken home, or there might be someone that comes from a very vibrant, strong community, but they might not have the same economic wealth as other people. So I think that, again, unless we're really defining what we're talking about here, rather than kind of putting people on this hierarchy and getting them to compete against each other in this identity category way.
It's not about people, it's about policy. So it's about the framing of policy. So I think that's where it will bring advantage, because it will ensure there's greater fairness and transparency behind policy. It's not about individuals, and therefore that's why government is consulting to ensure that we get this right. And ultimately, it will be about government ensuring that it gets its policy agenda right as well.
Do you want to come back on that?
I mean, it is about putting inequality at the heart of the government strategy. I mean, that's what it's about. It is saying that tackling inequality will make Britain a better country. And there's lots of evidence that actually if you bring people from all sorts of backgrounds, participating more in the economy, being able to progress, not just doing a job but getting a promotion, you'll have a stronger and fairer society and a better economy.
Final word on that?
Well, I mean, who can disagree with that? But, I mean, the reality is that sound bites are not going to get you to it. And you know, under the last government, there was a huge amount done to get people trained, to change what had been, you know, from Tony Blair's I want half of children to go to university, and then they were coming out not being able to get a job, to, you know, we need apprenticeships, we need T-levels. You know, that is where you're doing practical policies to move forward. I don't see what this actually does in terms of practical outcomes.
Now, some of you may be watching this from your sofas. You might be working from home and having your lunch break. Have a look at this. Britain is the work-from-home capital of Europe, according to one study. And there's a committee in the House of Lords which heard evidence yesterday in their inquiry into hybrid and remote working. And they heard from the chief executive at NHS Employers on the inequalities associated with working from home.
The biggest challenge is for colleagues from more socially excluded backgrounds, where there isn't perhaps the same level of access to broadband, where people are far more reliant on smartphones for accessing the internet than the kind of broadband connectivity that we might see more commonly in other parts of the population.
Rachel, do you agree with that? Do we need to get people back to work?
Well, I think there's pluses and minuses, as with all policy, and that's why Labour aren't dictating to employers what they should do as we look at our Make Work Pays offer. But we know that sometimes if you have a work at home day, your productivity can go up, but also that creativity which you get from working with other colleagues is a real benefit to business and services. So we need to get those balances right and ensure that people are able to contribute. For instance, if people have got caring needs, often it's better that they're at home, being able to focus on that alongside their work, as opposed to having to then spend time travelling in and being away from being able to provide that support. So I think we've got to be really pragmatic, but ensure that this is of benefit to the individual as well as to the business.
The Business Secretary said that he thought that if you can reach agreement with your employer, then it can be good for productivity. Do you agree?
But is it good for the person doing it? I mean, I have a real concern that, you know, we are social creatures, and if we come to where you can work from home, where is the human interaction? I worry about some of the mental health pressures. I worry about young people going into the workplace wanting to work from home and not realising that often their promotion ladder is about being amongst the people in the office who actually recognise you're there, out of sight, out of mind. I have my concern. Now, there's a balance to be had. You know, there is a balance to be had. You know, working from home one day a week, there is advantages to that. But I worry that if we say, if you want to work from home, you can work at home all the time, that actually the person who wants to work from home is the one who's going to suffer in the long run.
Ruffle, do you agree with that?
Yeah, different strokes for different folks. I mean, post-COVID, the labour market has changed for many jobs. You know, work from home is sort of a hygiene factor whether people might apply. It's often an important factor in retention as well. It enables people maybe who have caring requirements or maybe health difficulties to maybe participate in the workforce more greatly. But there are certain areas where actually does it provide the best environment. So younger people in particular who benefit hugely from being around colleagues. Obviously, there are lots of jobs where you can't work from home. We don't talk about those enough. So I think having flexibility for organisations is incredibly important.
Are you surprised that we are the working from home capital of Europe?
Yeah, no, I think that is somewhat surprising. But I kind of agree with a lot of what is already been said. I think that there are arguments on both sides. I think that if you are a young family, you know, particularly for a lot of women, having that kind of flexibility when you have young children and caring responsibilities is really important. But at the same time, as was mentioned, when it comes to a lot of young people, we talk about mental health a lot, and that kind of isolation and not having that social interaction is something that can have adverse impacts. And as you said, also overlooked for promotion and just learning in that very easy way that you can do very quickly in person. So I think that we do need to look at how to make working from home more productive, but I wouldn't say that it is
it that the employer doesn't necessarily know if someone's being productive? I mean, they will up to a point when they see the work, but is that the suspicion that you're at home and you're shirking?
It's also something you get from being around other people, bouncing ideas, the water cooler moments, those are important.
It is the water cooler, that's really important. And I do think that, I mean, with my team, I've always said, I don't really care what hours you work, you've got a job to do, you know, you do it. When one of my team has had her children, we said, you know, work from home. Eventually, she wanted to come back into the office more than the time she used to be in the office because she wanted adult interaction. That's all for today, but I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 11:15 here on BBC Two and iPlayer for Prime Minister's Questions. Thank you for watching.